Our speaker today, Chris Mooney, is a science and political journalist, blogger, podcaster, and experienced trainer of scientists in the art of communication. Many of you probably know him as a co-host of CFI's podcast, Point of Inquiry. He's also the author of 4 books, including the New York Times best-selling The Republican War on Science, as well as The Storm World, Hurricanes, Politics, and the Battle Over Global Warming, and Unscientific America. He blogs for Science Progress, a website of the Center for American Progress and Center for American Progress Action Fund. The title of his newest book, The Republican Brain, The Science of Why They Deny Science and Reality, is also the title of his talk today. Welcome, Chris.
I forgot to mic myself in advance. I'm so sorry about that. So just 1 minute here. This goes here. This is on, and it goes here. All right. So maybe we could lower the lights a little bit. It's a real privilege to be here with all of you to talk about the Republican brain. I'm sorry, I'm just getting queued up here. And let me say that in the book, I cite a large amount of scientific research. Interestingly, on Up with Chris Hayes on MSNBC yesterday, one of the scientists in the field was kind enough to say on the show that I had summarized that research accurately. They agree, broadly speaking, with that. But you are free-thinking, questioning folks, so I want to tell you that you can read it for yourself, the science for yourself. Go to scienceprogressaction.org/intersection. That's my blog, scienceprogressaction.org/intersection. And if you go down to the bottom of the page and go to a slightly older post around April 13th, then you'll see that I put up 2 links to a list of 19 studies showing a variety of different kinds of traits among liberals and conservatives, traits that are not what we typically think of as ideological, although I think that they ultimately are. And that's really still just a small smattering of the research out there. I'm saying this because this stuff is controversial, although it shouldn't be, but nevertheless it is. To me, it's obvious now that I've read it, but that's why I invite you to inform yourselves about it further, because I'm not going to go down into the details of every single study, but the amount of research out there is really huge. So I used to misunderstand the people who disagree with me, aka the political conservatives. I used to think what a lot of liberals still think about their opponents. You know, they're driven by religion on the one hand, or they're driven by money on the other. So if you want to understand a phenomenon like the denial of science coming from the right, which you see on global warming and evolution and so many other topics. I've been talking a lot about the denial of science on homosexuality lately. This crazy claim that you can't raise healthy kids in a same-sex marriage. They just made that one up. But they believe it, of course. And it's just like the denial of science on global warming. It's just as baseless. So if you want to understand why conservatives are doing that, well, it's either God or money. Now, that was the approach that I took in my 2005 book, The Republican War on Science, which played a pretty central role in defining this problem of the denial of science and denial of reality. And this is 2005. We did not realize at the time that we were echoing the cover of another popular book that was also out, and I think it sold more copies than I did. But my argument, the argument of the book on the left, was that was that science was under attack under the administration of George W. Bush on all these typical issues: global warming, evolution, stem cells, all the rest. And I think the ethos of the era was kind of perfectly captured in a quotation from the former president himself. This is Bush at a press conference following the 2004 tsunami that devastated Pacific Rim and Indian Ocean countries and killed so many people. And Bush was asked by a journalist a scientific question. The journalist said, "Mr. President, does the United States have a warning system in place for the purpose of detecting tsunamis?" And Bush had no idea, right? No earthly idea. But he tried to answer, and he tried to give a scientific response. He said, well, I think we might be less vulnerable to tsunamis than other parts of the world. But as he quickly caught himself and added, I'm not a geologist, as you know. All right? And so such was the Bush administration on science. So the book was popular. I went out and talked about it. And again, I had this causal story for why this is happening. And I would describe that causal story as political and environmental. We know what political means. Environmental, not in the sense of clean air and clean water, but in the sense of nurture rather than nature. All right. I was saying that conservatives do this. The Bush administration does this. It denies science. Because it has to carry water for interest groups that put them in power. All right? They got to do favors for the people who elected them. That's a political story. That's the kind of story that political journalists always tell, right? Follow the money. What interest groups are supporting this campaign? The interest groups, again, the religious right, corporate America, ExxonMobil, denying the science of global warming, funding the think tanks that deny the science of global warming, which has changed. It doesn't really do that anymore. And yet global warming denial has gotten stronger than ever. So what's up with that? It's not ExxonMobil's fault. This is one of the reasons why that explanation was so inadequate. And I began to realize more and more that this kind of explanation at the surface of things, which looked at political interests and how they compel political action, was not wrong, because clearly those things are going on, but it was inadequate because it didn't look beneath the surface at what's happening. And political journalists never look beneath the surface. They kind of pretend that we're all blank slates and we're all the same somehow. We just, maybe we have slightly different interests and those lead us to have different beliefs. Or maybe we have a slightly different upbringing and those lead us to have different beliefs. But it turns out to be an increasingly inadequate and frankly just myopic way of thinking about what's going on in politics. And I realized this as I started to look at some of the psychological research on conservatives and science. Before I talk about that, I do want to say that the Republican war on science argument was recently validated, and this is pretty awesome, right, by a sociologist in American Sociological Review. So it's not often that a journalist, finds a scientific paper appearing in the literature that says, we set out to test Mooney, parentheses 2005's thesis, and we validated the thesis. That's in the abstract of the study, basically. We validated the thesis based on new evidence. And that is what they did. Oh, cool, so I can be Darth Vader. Well, how do you... Whee! Isn't this annoying? Okay, don't ever do this with a pointer. But what you see, this is General Social Survey data, and they ask about people's trust in a variety of institutions. What do you think of the leadership of the military? What do you think of the leadership of Wall Street? What do you think of the leadership of Congress? People hate Congress, right? What do you think of the leadership of the scientific community? And all that Goshat did was break this down by ideology, break it down by liberal, conservative, and moderate. And conservatives are the red, and so their trust goes down and down and down over the last 35 years in the leaders of the scientific community. So proof. There's negativism towards science, and it isn't like across the board. It's conservatives who don't like science, and they've gotten worse. All right? That's what the evidence shows. But is this a purely environmental, is this a purely sociological phenomenon, or is it a psychological problem? The answer is both. The answer to everything is both. But let me tell you why I felt it was so important to highlight the psychological angle. The first reason was that I was becoming aware of research by an old friend who became a political scientist. His name is Brendan Nyhan, and he is at Dartmouth. And he studies something called motivated reasoning, how emotions drive our views, our beliefs. And he set up a really interesting study. It was basically having liberals and conservatives read fake newspaper articles that contained a factual claim stated by George W. Bush, very close to things that George W. Bush had actually said, or a factual claim stated by a Democratic leader that was false, a false factual claim. And then what was done is randomly manipulated whether people did or did not receive a factual correction of the false claim. So the false claim for Bush was either, there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or, the tax cuts increased revenue to the Treasury, right, which doesn't make any sense, but they always claimed that. And then what would happen when conservatives would read the false factual claim by Bush and then read a refutation of that claim? What did they do? All right, so who's seen the movie Swingers? Anybody? Okay, so you're playing blackjack, and you get dealt a 10 or 11. What do? Double down. That's what the conservatives did. That's what the conservatives did upon receiving a factual refutation of a false claim that they believed in. They became more sure that the false claim was true. They doubled down. Can you really explain this in a purely environmental fashion? I think you need to get a little psychological here. So this wasn't the only reason that I was drawn towards thinking about the denial of science, the denial of facts in a psychological way. I was also becoming aware of a phenomenon that in the book I called the smart idiot effect. Okay, this is I'm coining a term here. And I want to tell you how I learned about these fascinating people, the smart idiots. This is Pew data from 2008 showing the relationship between political party affiliation, level of education, and belief that global warming is caused by humans, or in other words, acceptance of scientific reality. And what it shows, so you got college grads and non-college grads, and you got Republican, Independent, Democrat in both columns. What it shows, therefore, is that if you're a Republican, then the higher your level of education, the more likely you are to reject scientific reality. Right? But if you're an independent or a Democrat, precisely the opposite is the case. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to accept scientific reality. So what is up with this? Right? What is going on here with these only 19% Republicans accepting what is clearly scientifically established, who are college grads, and those Republicans who are college grads being more wrong than the non-college grads? What is up with that? And of course, it is not only on global warming that we see a smart idiot effect. So this is data from John Sides, and it's studying in whom belief that President Obama is a Muslim increased from 2009 to 2010, and of course it increases most among the Republicans. But he breaks it down, again, by education, all right? So you got college grads, high school or less, some college, and what you see is the slope is much steeper for the more highly educated Republicans in believing this falsehood than for the less educated Republicans. So it's like if you're a Republican, education increases your risk of being wrong. Okay? So what is up with this phenomenon? How is this possible? Surely we need a psychological explanation for this. The political environmental narrative that journalists like to tell is probably not adequate to explain these kinds of things. We need something more. What the Republican War on Science didn't consider, and what our political and journalistic classes do not like to entertain, is the growing body of evidence suggesting that liberals and conservatives are just different people. Different people in ways that go far beyond and that appear to be largely prior to ideology. And then they are pushed or nudged in a sort of not entirely conscious fashion towards investing in and accepting political beliefs that mesh with who they are deep down. You just kind of gravitate towards them. You feel yourself doing it more than you think yourself doing it. And as I went to work on a new book about the denial of science, denial of reality, I found it impossible to ignore this growing body of evidence. That our beliefs, political and factual, are at least partly springing out of a set of core psychological or personality traits, even physiological traits, upon which people differ. And the differences seem to be at least partly inherited. Now, I want to be clear at the outset that liberals and conservatives, on average, are different groups of people psychologically is just a fact. It's a fact that is value neutral. It's a fact that, as I said, was just reaffirmed by a scientist I was on TV with yesterday. But of course, I got this fact from interviewing and reporting on the research of a lot of psychologists. It's a fact. It's value neutral. What you make of it's up to you. At this point, I just don't think you can ignore it any longer. All right? And I think it helps us understand as much about what is wrong with liberals as it does what is wrong with conservatives. All right? This fact cuts both ways. All right? It shows strengths and weaknesses in both camps. It leaves both groups unhappy if they fully understand some of the ramifications, and it makes them both happy in other ways. And we'll get more into that, but for now, let's just face the fact. The fact is actually something that people have sort of always known. Like all great insights, this is not a new one. This is Gilbert and Sullivan's Iolanthe, the playbill for the comic opera, which is from 1882. And in there, it's a comedy. They've got a verse, though, that essentially states this idea. And I was amazed to find this long before we had any real science to back it up. So old is it that probably they pronounced the English language a little bit differently then, which is why it doesn't rhyme anymore, according to how we pronounce it. So I'm going to pronounce it in a way that makes it rhyme. Nature always does contrive that every boy and every gal that's born into this world alive is either a little liberal or else a little conservative. Now, what is up with that? I mean, is it possible that we're liberal or conservative as children before we have what anyone would recognize as ideology? Are we already sort of set in motion in a way? And granted, we could be knocked off of the path that we're set in motion towards, but is it already kind of there already? The observation's not new. It's definitely not accepted, but it's actually not scientifically controversial. People just don't want to admit it. But it's getting harder and harder and harder to ignore. Because if ideology was just what most people think it is, the set of conscious ideas that you hold about how society should be structured and ordered, if that was what ideology was, then why would you find so many non-political differences between liberals and conservatives? Why would you find differences in how they organize their bedrooms? Right? But you do, right? Liberals are Messier. And come on, this is not really a surprise to you, is it? We all kind of know this, right? But there's research on this. Liberals are Messier, but they've got all kinds of cool stuff. CD collections, book collections, travel guides, interesting artwork. Conservatives are cleaner but more conventional in their decorations. So they've got like American flags and ironing boards and Scotch tape, So is that ideology? Well, it shows ideological differences. And if ideology is what we think it is, why would liberals and conservatives have different preferences for art? But again, there's research on this. And liberals like abstract art better. Right? And conservatives like representational art better, in the sense of portraiture and landscape paintings. Is that ideology? And by the way, I'm conservative in my art preferences. I'm conservative in a lot of ways, as it turns out, psychologically, but not ideologically. And we could talk about this more. Why would they have different senses of humor? But they do have different senses of humor. And there's fascinating research showing that liberals and conservatives both think Stephen Colbert is funny, but for very different reasons. Liberals think, accurately, that he's a parody of conservatives, but conservatives think he's actually one of them. Right? So, what is up with this thing called ideology? If even humor is political, is this joke political? Is this a liberal joke? I actually think it is. I think it's a liberal joke. How many of you get this joke? Okay, some of you get it. How many of you are like this? The differences, the non-ideological differences between liberals and conservatives, which I believe precede and set ideology in motion in a significant extent, go on and on and on. At the end of the book, I collaborated with a researcher named Everett Young, and in his PhD dissertation, he found the following things about conservatives versus liberals. Conservatives were more likely to think that the fans of rival sports teams were just bad people. All right? They were more likely to want to keep germs out of their bodies. And they were more likely to elect a candidate to Congress if they knew that that candidate kept his or her lawn neatly edged. Is that ideology? And it gets weirder because there's also research about how to transform a liberal into a conservative. And it turns out that you do this not through ideas or argument. You do this through emotional and physiological types of interventions. How do you make a liberal conservative? Alcohol. All right. So scientists set up outside of a bar with a breathalyzer and a political questionnaire. And they're asking people questions like, I think private property rights should be absolute. And they find a rightward shift in both liberals and conservatives in correlation with blood alcohol content. This is not the only way to make a liberal a temporary conservative until the hangover sets in. Right. Another very, very similar study produced the same basic effect by asking people political questions near a hand sanitizer. I'm not joking. They're priming people with the thoughts of cleanliness, and they're producing a rightward shift in their responses to political questions. This has also been done by putting people under time pressure, by making people distracted so that they can't focus a lot on what you're asking them because they're doing some other task. And most of all, I think that we all know that this is true. This is easily done by making people mortally afraid. They will shift right. All you have to do is attack them. And then other things don't matter, except having a strong leader who will protect you. So what is ideology? Where does it live? Where is it housed? And then things get really controversial. Because yes, we have studies that show some brain differences between liberals and conservatives. The book is not based on this. Right? This is the new stuff. It's the most controversial stuff. It's in the scientific literature and it should be discussed. But it comes with a lot of caveats. Let me just tell you a little bit about it, though. This is a British study, and these are brain scans. The study was actually commissioned by Colin Firth, all right? And he's one of the co-authors because he said, I wanted to find out what was wrong with the people who disagree with me. And the scientists actually found something. I don't endorse this idea that there's something wrong with people who disagree with me, but that was Colin Firth's statement. So yes, the scientists found something. They found more gray matter in the right amygdala of these more conservative University College of London students. Right amygdala is the brain's emotional fear and threat center. Protects you from harm. You should be very glad that you have one. All right? You share it with other animals, and it exists to take over and take control when you're in a situation of threat so that you can automatically act in a way to preserve your life. It does other things too, but that is a very, very important role, and it's not really surprising that evolution would produce such a thing. Liberals, in contrast, had more gray matter in the anterior cingulate cortex. And the anterior cingulate has been discussed a lot in the literature as an error-detecting region. And what that means is that if you're committing a series of behaviors and there's something wrong, you need to change, the anterior cingulate is sort of the snap to attention, stop doing that, do something different. Okay? You could see why this might be associated with liberalism. And you can spin out a lot of conclusions based on a brain study. But let's be cautious. We have large error bars for the scientists in the room. We have relatively small correlations for the scientists in the room. So R equals 0.23 for conservatism in the right amygdala. It's statistically significant, but it's not really a large effect. A correlation of 1 means that two variables are tracking each other perfectly. But a correlation of 0.23 means considerably less than that. So it is not like every time you find a relatively larger right amygdala, you find a conservative. Okay, clearly not. But nevertheless, this is real. And given all the other factors that probably influence ideology and random measurement errors, is nothing to sniff at. But again, I don't base the book on the new brain science, although I fully expect the new brain science to find all kinds of things like this, and the results to be consistent with what you're seeing here. But far more scientifically certain than that, far more well-established, and I think a foundation that you can definitely build a lot of argument on, as I did, is the finding that liberals and conservatives are different people when it comes to their personalities. And there's just tons and tons and tons of published research going back decades. And it pretty much always produces the same set of findings. And to show you this, I want to show you some personality questions that we asked in our study at LSU that I talk about at the end of the book. Questions that, again, I don't believe really have any political content, but nevertheless reliably produce political differences between people. So we would ask them, how much do you see yourself as artistic, a highly abstract thinker? And you're asked how much you agree with those two descriptions of yourself. And you rate yourself 1 to 7, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And then you get a series of other personality questions. You get, how much are you dependable, self-disciplined? Rate yourself. How much are you open to new experiences, complex? Rate yourself. Everybody has an opinion about where they fall on these relatively simple scales about themselves. And it turns out that you get reliably political differences in terms of the answers to these sorts of questions. Questions 1 and 3 are tapping a trait that's called openness to experience, which always skews liberal. And question 2 is tapping a trait called conscientiousness, which always skews conservative. These are 2 of what are called the Big 5 personality traits. And the Big 5 are a very accepted way of analyzing the human personality. What you've got here is a really, really awesome study that I talk about a lot. And what it's showing is how powerful the Big 5 traits are in influencing your ideology in comparison to your level of income and your level of education. So we got the Big 5 across the bottom. By the way, blue at the top are things that tend to make you liberal, and red at the bottom is things that tend to make you conservative. So in other words, how you should think about this is if you're scoring high on one of these, then on average it's pushing you liberal, or on average it's pushing you conservative. And the higher it is, then the stronger its effect is in pushing you in one direction or the other. Okay, so we've got conscientiousness. That's question number 2 is one of the questions they use to tap it, dependable, self-disciplined. This is wanting order and structure in your life. The kind of people that keep a clean apartment, right? The kind of people who like to be on time. This tends towards making you conservative. Openness to experience is, in this research, the number 1 influence on liberalism. All right? And openness to experience is wanting to try new things. Sensation seeking. It's been called neophilia. Right? New things, new people, also new ideas. Agreeableness. We got a split in terms of its influence on ideology. And by the way, I should say that we've got 3 kinds of ideology. We've got just self-description as liberal or conservative. We've got economic liberal conservative. We've got social liberal conservative. So conscientiousness is making you all kinds of conservative. Openness is making you all kinds of liberal. They're splitting on agreeableness. We all know what agreeableness is. It includes things like empathy and politeness. Stability is the opposite of neuroticism. So conservatives are less neurotic than liberals. I told you, this is not all just good news for liberals, right? Conservatives are more extroverted, all right? They've got more friends, probably. And then they compare it to 2 of the sort of factors that everybody is willing to admit influence your political views, which is your level of income and your level of education. And so sure enough, having a very large income has a very large effect in making you an economic conservative. Duh. All right? And having a high level of education has a very large effect in making you a social liberal and also a general liberal, but not an economic liberal. This is not surprising, but what is surprising and what people don't like to admit is that personality is at least as big of an influence and even bigger. And of course, personality is significantly genetic. Okay? How does this explain the battle over reality and what's true? Liberalism comes from openness and education. Conservatism comes from money and structure. Why do conservatives and liberals believe different things, and why do liberals tend to be right? It's right there. It's all about the lack of openness. That is my argument. So we need to talk a lot more about what openness is and what the lack of openness is. Here are some slogans that go along with the open personality. This explains why you people pay too much money for Mac computers. You're susceptible to marketing campaigns that appeal to your openness. All right? And conservatives are probably susceptible to campaigns that appeal to their relative lack of openness. Openness is about intellectual flexibility and tolerance of uncertainty, ambiguity, nuance, and change. You're cool with this stuff. Doesn't bother you much. In some cases, you really want this stuff. You want novelty. You want to experience different things than you've experienced before. Different people. You want to travel. You want to experience life in its fullness. You're not going to be content spending your whole 40-year career working for the same company. Maybe. I would postulate, and I'm not just going to postulate, I'm going to assert, very confidently, that these are strong characteristics of scientists as well, and the scientific community. And it is indeed, as we'll see, a very, very liberal community of people on average. Now, I want to highlight how important this influence of openness on ideology is. Because what it suggests is that across time periods, across countries, across political systems, there's an exploratory side of human nature, captured in openness, that leads people to broadly liberal tendencies, especially when they have the choice, and it's not a totalitarian society. In other words, the side of human nature that's friendly to change, friendly to difference, friendly to new ideas, pushes people towards embracing liberalism, and of course liberalism is best defined as the embrace of change versus conservatism is best defined as the resistance to change in a lot of different contexts. Conservatism is not an exploratory ideology, it's a defensive ideology, and it is friendly to stability, structure, and certainty. All right? So no matter how political systems change, no matter how culture changes, there's a psychological core to the difference between left and right, and that explains why it turns up again and again and again across eras. And to show this, let's go back in time to the time when left and right was invented, the French Revolution. This is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and people blamed him for the French Revolution, right? I mean, he certainly wasn't the only cause, but he was the intellectual cause, because in the social contract, he came up with this idea of the general will, which was used to explain why the Ancien Regime had to be overthrown, and it was in the French Revolution that left and right were first defined as support for the Ancien Regime versus resistance to the Ancien Regime. And this was based upon what part of one of the assemblies. There were so many assemblies in the French Revolution. Forget which one it is. It was based on where people sat, on the left or the right. So what kind of a person was Jean-Jacques Rousseau? He was an open person centuries before our current time. But if you look at how Carlyle described his personality, it comes across so strongly. He could be cooped into garrets, he could be laughed at as a maniac, he could be left to starve like a wild beast in his cage, but he could not be hindered from setting the world on fire. That's Rousseau. That's a liberal. It's a liberal in the 18th century. Okay? Openness, or the lack of openness, beats a very clear pathway towards understanding conservatives and their sometimes troubled relationship with facts. Right? Openness is inversely related to another trait that we study, that is studied much in the published psychology literature, called the need for cognitive closure. All right? If you're not open, you're closed. You need closure. You need an answer. You need certainty so that you can quash ambiguity and stop having to think about it. All right? This trait is associated with what's called seizing and freezing. So you find information that supports what you believe in, you seize, because then you've got it, you've got the certainty, and then you freeze, because you don't want any more information. You limit your information search, and if someone attacks the certainty that you got in such a satisfying way, then you fight back to defend your beliefs. This is associated with conservatism versus liberalism. We have research showing that high need for closure is associated with anti-evolutionism. We have research on Tea Party members who deny global warming, and they say that they're very sure of themselves and they don't need any more information about the issue. At the extreme of low openness, people don't question authority, they respect authority. They are authoritarians. Tons of research on this conservative personality type. Tends to be a Christian fundamentalist in the United States. In another country, might be a different kind of fundamentalist, but tends to be a fundamentalist, right? Because they want certainty. They want order. They want structure. They don't want ambiguity. They tend to see the world more in a black and white way. You're either with me or against me. My way or the highway. Good and evil. Christian, Muslim. They're also very supportive of hierarchy. And I was thinking that inequality is actually okay. You need some people on top. Some people with the power. And that's good. Usually, those people are what? They're male, they're white, and they're straight. Okay? That's an authoritarian. And this feels right to them. Right? So there's a lot of research on reasoning in authoritarians, showing that they're more defensive and emotional about their beliefs. They're more fixed in their views. They're more likely to make up their minds based on quick fire system 1, it's called, cognition, rather than system 2, which is second stage thinking, which is, more of taking time rather than responding more automatically and instinctively. There's research showing that in some groups of authoritarians that have been studied, this hasn't been studied too much, but I've found a number of studies in the literature, authoritarians are engaging in more selective exposure to information sources that agree with them. Okay. So there's one study of Democrats, independents, and Republicans and what kind of media they consume. And this was done by Shanto Iyengar at Stanford and his colleagues. And what they did was it's called the selective exposure study. They take a series of newspaper headlines or article headlines, and what they randomly manipulate is whether you see a Fox logo on it or a CNN logo on it or an NPR logo on it or BBC, whatever. Okay? And then they just simply give liberals and conservatives or Democrats and Republicans choices. Right? What would you like to read? Whether it's a travel story or a political story, whatever. What do you click on? And the only thing that they're studying is the logo. And so what they found was that the probability that Republicans would select a CNN or an NPR report was 10%. Okay. They're overwhelmingly selecting Fox. And they didn't find the same kind of allegiance to one information source among the liberals and Democrats. They definitely found a Fox aversion, right? But they didn't find any sort of one information source. They found them going out and grazing and exploring, which is what they do, which is what they're like. When it comes to explaining why conservatives are factually wrong today, this would be very helpful in explaining the Fox News effect, which is that if you watch Fox, the likelihood of you being wrong increases. Right? Wrong about global warming, wrong about health care. And I mean factually wrong, not like you have a political opinion that's wrong. Wrong in thinking that global warming isn't real. Wrong in thinking that the health care bill created death panels. Wrong in thinking that Iraq did have weapons of mass destruction. Wrong in thinking that President Obama was not born in the United States and so forth. Right? Tons of research showing that Fox News increases your risk of holding these wrong beliefs. Why is it happening? We now give our nature-nurture explanation, which is what this research allows us to do. Fox is both misinforming people by sowing doubt about global warming, because there's a snowstorm, oh my God, there must be no global warming, right? It's sowing doubt, but people who are authoritarian conservatives are also selecting in, okay? They're selecting to consume the information that affirms their worldview. So you have a feedback between that need for affirmation on the one hand and the misinformation that they're getting on the other. And that's how you have the Fox News effect. So you need both a nature and a nurture explanation. Of course, liberals will select into certain kinds of things too based upon their psychological identities. So what do they select into? And how does this affect the battle over reality? They strongly select into and select to remain in higher education. Right? And this has a huge, huge effect. The university is kind of a dream area for liberals. All right? It's kind of like an intellectual playground for them because they get to experience things, they get to experience difference. They get to experience new ideas. They get to graze. They get to try a lot of different courses. And so sure enough, it's highly political, whether you are highly educated. All right? And I don't just mean going to college, I mean staying in college and getting advanced degrees. So if you look at members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, only 6% are Republicans today. If you look at college professors across the board, only about 14% are Republicans today. If you look at liberals versus conservatives, you find a much higher concentration of advanced degrees among liberals. So liberals are selecting in to academia, and here's a quotation from a sociologist who studies the politics of academia, saying that, more so than ever before, the highly educated are a constituency for American liberalism, not conservatism. And this is incredibly psychologically important in terms of acceptance of facts. Because if you are a liberal, it turns out that you've spent more time, on average, in a university context, where you've basically become friendly towards scientifically oriented kind of people. And you're likely to have learned the norms of scientific research. Okay? How you withhold your assent to a conclusion until you've got a body of evidence to support it, and how you use nuance and you describe the uncertainty properly, and all these kinds of things that scientists do. So it's much harder for you to fly in the face of all that. Right? It's much harder, whereas conservatives, as I've shown, they increasingly distrust this whole world. So openness is feeding into this increasing divide over both participation in higher education at the higher levels, and also acceptance of what people who are in academia or science have to say. So that's a psychological effect as well. So it's kind of like liberals have the right friends, basically. If you want to be right about things, it helps to be friendly with the scientists. And so if you want to understand why conservatives are denying reality, it's certainly the lack of openness and all the cognitive and psychological things that entails, but it's also the big difference that you see on higher education. So what does it all lead to? Stephen Colbert put it like this: reality has a well-known liberal bias. Now, what I'm essentially arguing is that that's not just funny, that is true, and it's part of the nature of things. It's the way it naturally ought to be. You would expect to find liberals and scientists on the same side of most issues. And you would expect conservatives to, more than liberals, just be wrong and be dogged about it. And that is absolutely the case in the United States today, especially when conservatism today is such an extreme conservatism and such an authoritarian conservatism, which it undeniably is. And we could cite polls all day to prove this, but I'll just give you 3. 64% of Republican voters in the 2010 election thought it was not clear whether President Obama had been born in the United States. 55% of authoritarians, but only 19% of non-authoritarians, believed that Saddam Hussein had been directly involved in the 9/11 attacks. Only 18% of Republicans and Tea Party members accepted the scientific consensus that global warming is caused by humans. So there you are. None of this means that liberals can't be wrong. All right? And if any of you watched Up with Chris Hayes yesterday morning, where we talked about this at great length, myself and Jonathan Haidt, neither of us were saying that, and Haidt has a framework, as do other researchers, for explaining when liberals will be wrong. Okay? Because what we haven't talked about yet is that the left and right are divided not only by psychology, not only by perhaps slight differences in brain structure, not only by genetics, not only by physiological responses, I'm going to talk about those a little bit, they're divided by morality. All right? And morality means the emotions that you feel about situations before you're even thinking about them. All right? Different moral impulses that then guide our reasoning. So, if you hit liberals with information in a sort of moral sweet spot, or a weak spot, if you push a particular emotional button with them, you can get them to reason emotionally in a less than rational fashion, and you can get them to believe wrong things. And this is one way of dividing up liberal and conservative morality. So you have 2 dimensions. You've got people who are very hierarchical versus people who are very egalitarian. All right? Hierarchical means you actually think inequality is good, and we talked about hierarchy with the authoritarians and believing that some people should be running things. All right? versus liberals incredibly egalitarian. You know, we want everyone to be equal, regardless of sexual persuasion, regardless of race, regardless of gender. Right? This is one of the big dividers between the left and the right. And then you've got individualistic versus communitarian. An individualist basically believes that a fair society is one in which you either get ahead or fall behind based upon your own merits, and that's the way the system ought to work, and that's fair, and that's right. And a communitarian believes something quite different. They believe that it takes a village. We all should take care of each other, and the government should protect everybody, regardless of their inherent abilities, and it should step in when some kind of harm is being created. So, hierarchical individualism is where the Republicans live. Egalitarian communitarianism is where the Democrats live. And you can get all kind of biased reasoning if you prime people by pushing individualist, communitarian, hierarchical, egalitarian, emotional buttons, as many situations do. And so, where do you get wrong liberal reasoning? It will be down in this quadrant. And what kinds of issues live in this quadrant? Vaccination is a great example. Because if you're an egalitarian liberal, then you are suspicious of concentrations of power. That includes big corporations. And if you're a communitarian liberal, then you think that the government should step in to protect people from harm, especially harm caused by big corporations. So if you were told, and especially harm to children, of course, so if you were told that big corporations have done something unsafe and they are causing an epidemic of autism among children through the needles that were claimed to be able to protect them, but in fact are damaging them in this horrible, horrible way, then you've been told something that an egalitarian communitarian is likely to believe. If that information turns out to be wrong, then you're going to find egalitarian communitarians, perhaps, depending upon the sociology of things, holding to their fixed wrong belief. There's a lot of issues that live down here. They all involve corporations. A lot of them involve corporations. And corporations do bad things. But if they didn't actually do a bad thing, but people claim they did, then it's really easy to get liberals to believe it. All right. So I'm in no way saying that the left is always right. But I am saying that psychologically, the left has sort of the hardware to be right and to figure out what's right. So let me conclude. Some slogans. Science describes reality, but human beings are really good at screwing this up. It might be the case that this is true of some human beings a little bit more than others. All right? Reality still matters. Facts still matter. We still need to know what's true. And we need to communicate what's true. But it would be helpful to know what we're up against, what we're dealing with, and to do research on that. And you cannot unring this bell. You cannot put this knowledge back in the box. This knowledge proceeds apace, and it is getting even more interesting. The stuff that I didn't cover enough in the book, I now regret, although some of it's in there, is this physiological research on left and right. Physiological responses that are completely uncontrolled, all right, and that differ from left to right. This is the Political Physiology Laboratory at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And what they do is they put liberals and conservatives in various kinds of measuring devices. They put them in an eye tracker device, which measures where their eyes go, what their eyes look at, automatically, rapidly, when they're shown collages of different kinds of images. They also have a skin conductance measurement, which basically measures how much your sweat glands moisten, which is a way of measuring the arousal of the nervous system when they see images. And so it turns out that there's just giant differences between liberals and conservatives with different types of images on these kinds of measures. And conservative eyes go to images of scary, threatening, and disgusting things. All right? And they stay there long. They go there faster and they stay there longer. Liberal eyes look at like the happy bunny rabbit in the picture. Right? They're doing different things. All right? So in conclusion, I want to leave you with some words of eternal wisdom from a profound philosopher, Yoda. Yoda said, "You must unlearn what you have learned." When it comes to the denial of science, the denial of facts, reaching people who disagree with us. That's the situation that we're in. Thank you very much.